Pastor Meredith.
Pastor DJ.
So last night, I don't sleep well on Saturday nights because I'm excited about church.
I don't sleep well on Saturday nights either.
Oh, really? I also don't sleep well because I have 3 kids who like to hang out.
I have 3 kids too.
That's fun. So we do have
We
a
should
lot.
hang out sometime.
That joke went better when we practiced it. All right, let's just get to it. So we want to do theological discussions like this. And so it's supposed to be unscripted. We have a few talking points. But the reason why we deviate from a standard sermon and do things like this is very intentional for us. We talk through our faith, what we're doing as a church every day of the week pretty much together. And it's been wonderful to learn and serve with Meredith. But what we realized is our hope and prayer is that we give you tools so you can have conversations with those who you live with, your classmates, those who you work with as well. And so what we want to be able to do is offer 2 or 3 questions right now, have a dialogue together, and hopefully that will invite you when you're hanging out before or after or during the Super Bowl or whatever you're doing today to want to talk about your faith and how this sermon series has affected you. So we have the questions that we're going to put on the screen so you can follow along with us here. But this theological discussion is meant to be more of a dialogue. So interrupt if you'd like, jump in, and disagree absolutely if you want to as well, because there's room for that in our church. So Pastor Meredith, the first question I want to ask you is for you personally, what does it getting it right as a Christian look like for you?
For me, when I feel like I'm getting it right as a Christian is when I'm actually carving out time, and sometimes, quite frankly, that's 30 to 60 seconds, to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit, rather than crowding my life with so much busyness and so much determination that voice doesn't have a chance to speak. I think about that part from Ephesians that Janice read. The first line was something like, to live a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Right? And if I am to fully live into my calling, I have to include the Holy Spirit in that conversation. Now, sometimes getting it right for me, listening to the Spirit and kind of walking in that way, means apologizing a lot. I was laughing when the choir sang this song because one of the sticking points, I have 3 children in our house right now, as some of you know, is willingness to get dressed in the morning. And we actually use this song to motivate people. We sing, "Get your coat on in the car right now. It is time to go to school," right? To greater or lesser. But sometimes that fight can go too far. And sometimes even mothers and fathers have to apologize, right? So sometimes listening to the voice of the Spirit means asking and receiving forgiveness for times I really screw up, for times I lose my temper and don't listen not only to the voice of the Spirit, but to the voices of the people around me. Even pastors screw up, right? There are other times, though, where living out my calling means, later in that passage from Ephesians, Paul uses the language, speaking the truth in love. And for those times, I don't feel like I need to apologize, right? When I'm trying to balance kind of saying what needs to be said, things that God has laid on me that need to be spoken to the world in a loving way so that things change. Assuming that I'm still breathing, after worship today, I'm getting on an airplane to go to Washington, D.C. for a week to visit. It's a branch of our church called the General Board of Church and Society. And there's a bunch of clergy coming together from around the world, literally across the street from Capitol Hill, which I find amazing. So while we're there, we're going to be hearing about how the church is using its voice to further God's vision of justice in the world. We're going to be hearing about what the church is doing to curb gun violence, and that includes legislation that it's in favor of. We're going to be learning about how the church is working to end HIV and malaria around the world, and we're going to be learning about how the church feels called and is living out its calling as the United Methodist Church to look at the budgets that we set in this country as moral documents. And are they really reflective of what we value about the most vulnerable folks in our society? And I recognize, and I've heard from some of you this week, that not everyone agrees that this is the best way to accomplish God's vision for the world. I don't apologize, though, for going and learning and trying and using my voice in ways that I have discerned make sense to further that vision. Because for me, using my voice to take a stand in really risky ways is part of how I live a life that's worthy of the calling to which I have been called. So that's some of how I feel like I'm getting it right when I'm getting it right as a Christian. What does that look like for you?
I had a church member email me this week and he said, we know when we get it right about 220 years after we've done it. Because hindsight is really beautiful when it comes to stuff like this. Getting it right as a Christian sometimes for us means being prophetic, which is going against the grain. And going against the grain means speaking things that may not be completely popular at that time. So I appreciate where you're coming from, speaking truth and knowing when to apologize and when not to. One of the things I think we do when we get it right is we make sure that we use I statements when we talk about our faith. This is what I believe. This is where I am. And by the grace of God, I can still grow. And I believe that. I was looking, when I couldn't sleep last night, I looked through some of my old sermons from years ago. Man, I'm so glad you didn't have to hear some of those. They were horrible. But here's the truth, right? I was learning and growing as I did it. And just like you folks, the folks I was serving at the time, they got it. They got that. There's a guy who's learning and growing in faith as well. And I made some mistakes, and will continue to. I'm going to make mistakes at our church. I hope they're not too big. And I hope they're the ones I can stand before you and say, I'm sorry. Or I was taking us down this road, and we need to take a left turn because this isn't the right way. One thing I know about how we get it right is when we listen to one another, and we leave room for lots of dialogue. And when you and I can respectfully disagree, one of the things we struggle with when we do this conversation is we try to look for points of friction because we want to show you that it's okay as pastors to have different opinions. Right now, some of the things we've been doing, we've been kind of agreeing on more. So you're going to hear me try to push Meredith, but at the same time, I'll be like, to play devil's advocate. So I really think one of the ways we can get it right is to make sure that your opinion does matter. We may have different opinions on how we deal with gun control or guns in the U.S., but I need to learn how to respect you from that and say, this is Meredith as a mother, as a person, as a human being, and will you hear where I'm coming from? And what can I learn from you in that conversation? I love that you have that approach as well.
And I watched this happen, I think I told you, in the life of our church this week. We are, as a church, learning and growing in how to disagree in love. And I watched two people who really did not think the same thing about whatever we were talking about. And one of them looked at the other and said, but I know, while we're talking, that you love me anyway. And guess what? I have to love you anyway, too. And they were mad, but they kind of meant it. They really meant it. And I don't think that's true in a lot of segments of our society right now. So that's something I really value about our church. I'm curious, though, since this is the end of the sermon series on when Christians get it right and get it wrong, my next question for you is this: where have you seen God throughout this process?
One of the biggest ways I've seen God in the clearest ways has been through you all. And I mean that from people who've been here forever and people who just came once and then dropped me an email that week. And so I really do mean that. I've seen God in this process in really scary ways. This has been the toughest sermon series I've ever preached in all my time, simply because it is scary to stand before you and say, this is where we as a church get it wrong. I really think it would have been better served for us to say when pastors get it wrong.
I don't think they have enough time for that sermon.
There's a picture that went viral this week, or last couple of weeks. It was a tip by a pastor left to someone at Applebee's. And if you're not familiar with this, there's a big group of people, and they went and had food, and if you're 8 or more, automatic gratuity is placed at 18%, and the person said, I give God 10%, why would I give you 18%? Pastor is how it was assigned. And they crossed out the tip, and they only gave 10%.
No, I think they gave 0.
Okay, you're right, thank you.
0.
They gave 0. Yeah. And I'm excited to say this person was not Methodist when they came out who it was, but it could have been too. And the truth is the way the story's played out has been really sad and scary, talking about how we reflect Christ in the world, right? So it's not about tipping for me. It was about the theological underpinning of, this is who I understand God to be, why do you deserve more? And that was really scary. This person, when this picture got posted, got the person who posted it fired. So you work at Applebee's, you make minimum wage, and you live off of tips the way our system is built in the U.S. So tipping is really important. This is just my opinion. To make a decent living as a person, and that's your best means. So to get that person fired for me, that was getting it wrong, just plain wrong. And that scares me. And so many times I find myself looking back at my sermons or other people who I believe are under the umbrella of a people of faith who make our lives harder. And intentionally or unintentionally, we all live by grace, but gosh, that's hard. I quoted Driscoll last week, and that quote about President Obama, that infuriated me.
I mean the thing where Mark Driscoll said that President Obama didn't really believe in God.
Yeah, praying on a Bible he doesn't know to a God he doesn't know. And, from a personal perspective, that was really tough to swallow. Really hard to look at Mark Driscoll and say, you are also a pastor, you are also a person who's growing in faith. I think it's easier for me to point fingers at other Christians than non-Christians, actually. And that's a point where I see of God in this process, to realize that this sermon series has been almost too easy to write about where we have gotten it wrong. And we haven't celebrated the moments when we said, we've really gotten it right. And I'm excited, and in just a little bit, we'll talk about some of the ways we got it right. So do you have any thoughts about that or anything you disagree?
About where I've seen God, part of the challenge of being a pastor is we do spend a lot of our time in the church, and we are grateful for you all who actually live your lives out in the world more than we get to. I really have glimpsed God living my life in this little church bubble in the way that our faith community has really been willing to engage each other and has been willing to say difficult things that need to be said. And I haven't seen people cross that line into meanness in a way. There have been really strong disagreements, really strong, that have come out of this 6 weeks of sermon series. But the disagreement has been done with respect and honesty and grace and deep faithfulness. And again, this is something that I don't often see right now in our country and our culture at large. I worry a little bit that we're losing the chance to do that. And I really see God at work in the ways that this faith community, at least, is learning how to talk to each other.
So what are some of your growing edges, or some of the edges you see in our church here?
My growing edge as a Christian right now is I talked to you about listening for the voice of the Spirit, and my temptation as a person of action is to jump in with 2 feet and fix stuff right away. I see this needs to be fixed and this needs to be fixed, and I'm just going to fix it all for you. And that's not always, I'm learning, faithful. Not only because I don't always know what needs to be done unless I listen first, and because sometimes if I wait and give the Spirit time to move, the paths that God unfolds before me make a lot more sense than the paths I would have forged through the wilderness with a machete on my own, quite frankly. The growing edge, and for me as a pastor, though, is you talked about using I statements. In my personal prayer life, I'm always asking God for discernment, right? Like, what is the right way for me to be? As a pastor who serves a church of 600 people in a community of thousands, part of the call, too, is to ask God and to discern how God is calling me to lead this community as one of its pastors. What's the path that's unfolding for this particular congregation? And that's hard, and that's requiring a different kind of listening that I haven't done before, because I've never served a community quite this large before. That being said, I think I'm excited about the edge that I find this church on right now. This is a church, as I spoke of before, that's really deeply compassionate, and that's real. And I see that on Sunday morning. I see that in tiny little things that people don't even think about doing, ways that they help each other, ways that we speak to each other, sort of the random acts of kindness that permeate this whole community. The growing edge, though, I think, is how do we turn those random acts of kindness that we do for somebody that we pass and never see again, how do we turn that into a relationship with that person, where we really understand their story and not just the one moment where there's a kind interchange? And once we've got a relationship with the people that we encounter, how do we turn kindness and compassion into justice? How do we look at the whole big picture so that this person that I've encountered who seems to be suffering, how do we build a society, how do we build a world, how do we build God's kingdom where that particular kind of suffering isn't going to happen anymore? And that's a growing edge, I think, for the church, and it's one that I'm really excited about, as you can see by the fact that I don't have a voice, but my hands are doing all the talking this morning. What would you say, though? What are your growing edges as a person, as a pastor, and as a leader of this church?
As a pastor of our church, I think the one word that's come out the most for me in the last 7 or 8 months we've been here is trust. I talked last week, and we all know, many of us know, that there are a lot of things we're going through that have started long before Pastor Meredith and I came, but we're looking at what does it mean to be reconciling, which is a way of saying, how do we welcome all people homosexual, lesbian, gay. What could that mean for us? Is that something that we as a church will take on as a mantle? Our stewardship and how we do our finances. Our staff has changed greatly from retirements to new hires. We've done so many significant changes since we've showed up here July the 1st. The one thing I hear God telling me is, trust the people who were here before you. And that is hard. As a pastor, I feel like somewhere, maybe it was a movie or something, I was trained to believe that I can come in with a formula or with my experience and tell you what we need and show you the way to go. But the truth is the best I feel like I can do where I am in my journey right now is to sit and listen. Maybe you completely disagree with everything that's happening right now, but the fact that you're willing to sit and share your hearts and where you are, and maybe 2 or 3 people have completely different opinions about whatever topic it may be, to trust that God is at work in our church, to trust that God is at work in your hearts. My first Sunday here, I asked you all to turn your cell phones on. I said, if you hear something amazing, I want you to text or tweet or Facebook or write a note and call somebody after church and say, God is doing something amazing here. I had no idea what that would do for our community, because what I'm learning is you all are showing up to church and you don't just hope, you expect that God's going to do something amazing here. Do you get how amazing that is? How special that is? And what a wonderful thing that God is doing in our community, not because of what we're doing, but I feel like that's a huge growing edge for us. I feel like we're on the cusp of trying new things, of being willing to risk ourselves, to risk everything to be who God calls us to be. And I got to be perfectly honest, I feel so vulnerable as your pastor. It is a scary place to be, to want to do all these things. And yet, it's one of the most exciting places to be, because I show up to church on Sunday morning and I'm excited to see you. Go to work on Monday to answer emails because I'm so excited to see what God not only could be doing, but God's already doing. I think our biggest challenge we have as a church right now is public relations. We do so many good things that not enough people know about it. Feeding people, clothing people who are hungry. On Monday, I mentioned something to you. Kenmore Safeway has been a partner of the Bothell Community Kitchen, which is a ministry of our church. We serve the community meal about 50 people every Sunday night on an average Sunday. We average about $11,000 that the Kenmore Safeway gives to us to help to distribute. And we work with HopeLink and other great partners. This last year on Monday, they donated nearly $40,000.
In food, $40,000 in food.
Excuse me, in food. And here's some pictures of some of our great leaders who helped to pick that up. And we were working with HopeLink. $40,000 in food is about 16 pallets worth of food. We picked up maybe an eighth of that. And a lot of that other food got distributed to help hopefully start a new site at a Lutheran church. So there could be a HopeLink site in Kenmore. Right now, the closest site to where we live for our folks is in Kirkland. With the price of gas and with transportation being what it is nearly impossible for some of our folks who need food the most to get there. So I pray that we can start that site. And that's HopeLink. That's not even us as a church. But to see that Mike Bauer, who's the manager of that store, could go out on a risk to donate that much money and to trust community partners like us to make sure that children, women, and men are fed and have enough to sustain life, that is amazing. And it wasn't like the ramen and cup of noodles kind of stuff you usually get. I may love that because it's an extra fun, but what they did was they gave over about 40 different items that gave good quality food, the kind of food that you and I would feed our children and our friends. There is something amazing about that. To me, this is a great example of when Christians get it right. And the work that our church leaders are doing to do that. Meredith and I, we weren't even there. This has started years before we showed up. And it's the folks around you, people who you're sitting next to, maybe even you, who said, you know what, there's a problem, there's a challenge, I'm going to do something about it. For me, that's a great example of a growing edge of our church. Now, here's where I think we need to go next. I think we need to continue to do acts of mercy, acts of charity. People come in to schools with no shoes. We as a church across the street need to be able to provide those shoes for them. That's not even without a question for me. I think we do mercy and charity really well here, and we can continue to get better. What we can now do is begin to dream about as a church, how do we do acts of justice to change the systems that got people who are in the situations they're in into those spots? What can we do to change things, to really change their lives and not just fix something for that day or that week? We do mercy great. Our growing edge is justice. I don't know what the answer is today, but I know that we've got some great leaders in our church. I know that I'm listening. I know that we'll be looking at what does it mean for us as a church to be amazing and to do the work we're called to do. Ephesians 4, chapter 6 says this. Jeremiah, when God called him And when God calls anybody, it's always scary. Jeremiah said, "O Lord, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy." I think one of the things that we do, that I do as one of your pastors, is I limit us by saying we are only one church. We are only a few of us. There's only 600 with thousands. There's a whole world around us. It's only one of us. And I really, really honestly, honest to goodness believe that our church, partnering with other groups, can do something really amazing. That we can really fight hunger and homelessness. We can really change lives in our community, not because we want to, but because it's our responsibility as a people of faith. How we get there, it's going to be a great time. It'll be a great ride together in how we do that. But I know that's our calling of our church. That's where we can go. I'm excited to hear more from you. Thanks, Pastor Meredith, for your time this morning.
Amen.
Amen.